Hi and welcome. Today I will be answering a question that many people ask and confuses many people, and that is when you're mounting these two-piece cranks where the spindle is a part of the right hand side crank and you just have the left hand side crank to attach to later. So for those systems, bearings and bottom bracket bearings and their cups usually or very often have some spacers. So do you need to mount spacers? How many spacers? Do you need them on both sides, and why? So that's what I will be answering today. So what I did in this video is that I did write a script, and we'll go over this in a lot more detail. This is just to prevent me from making too many digressions and to try and stick to the point, because it is a topic that is touching some other topics. And so, for example, I do have a video about how to do the procedure for mounting the bottom bracket bearings and installing the crank. So I will not be going into those details. And also there will be a table of contents that's visible in this video's description and in the timeline, so that you can skip to the parts of interest. This first part is called the introduction. And now some notes. I have three important notes to say here first. And the first one is that I will be mostly dealing with Shimano threaded Hollowtech II bottom brackets and cups, but I will explain all the hows and whys so that you can apply that information to other models from different manufacturers and for press fit and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when you Google your bottom bracket bearing model or cranks model, you usually can find manufacturer specifications and instructions on whether you need spacers and how many and on which side. So Google your model, then make a space and say user manual or dealer's manual or something like that. So you can usually find that, and when you do it by the book, if everything on your bike is standard and or more or less okay, you should be good. However, that leads me to the third and final note, starting note, and that is that sometimes you deliberately want to make some improvisations, or you must because of how your bike is configured. So in this video, again, I will try to explain all the hows and whys so that you can know what are the problems with improvisation and what to pay attention to. Okay, so with that out of the way, let us move on. The second big point is why we are doing that. When I'm doing something, I like to know why I'm doing and to understand it. So we have three goals when we are dealing with those spacers and mounting our cranks. So our goals, I wrote them down here. The first one is the chain line. Front chain line in particular. In this case, we want basically to have our front chainring or chainrings to be in line with the cassette. We don't want them to be far off, far out, or too close inwards, because then we will have our chain running at an angle, and that causes poor shifting, your chain dropping when you back pedal, and all other more wear on the components and many other problems. For chainline, I do have a video, separate video, where I've explained that, and article, and I will list those in this video's description. If I forget, use the comment section to remind me. So that's our first goal. All these three goals are what we are trying to achieve ideally at the same time when we are mounting our cranks and dealing with spacers. The second goal is to have our pedals symmetrical, and by that I mean to have the right hand pedal and left hand pedal approximately at the same distance from the frame's center line, so that your legs are normally riding, so they are not at one side or at the other. So we don't want any drastic asymmetry, is that the right word in English, for when it comes to pedals. And third and final, we have to worry about the spindle protrusion. And what I mean by that, this is what standard two-piece crank looks like, and we have a certain length of the spindle. So when we install this into our frame, if we have too many spacers on the right hand side, so it's too far out, then it will not stick out enough for us to mount the left hand side crank. So it would be like this when you're watching, I think. So anyway, that's one concern. Also, we don't want it to be too far out. This is what I try to draw here. If we move the right hand crank and spindle to the left, also the other end move to the left, as well as the left spindle. And that is because when you look at this system, we do have some wiggle room for the left hand spindle crank to move in or out. So we do have some playroom, but it is not unlimited. Here I can only push it this far. After that it will no longer go in, and we would have, if we make this protrude too much out of the frame, then we would have some distance, some free play in our cranks when we mount them in the frame, and so they will be able to move and change your chain line as you're riding. It will not be held in securely, and also the bearing preload is adjusted by pushing the crank, at least with this model. So if with some it's on the other side, but you always have a certain amount of bottom bracket bearing preload that you can adjust, but it is not unlimited. So if the spindle is too long, if we don't put enough spacers all together, then we will have a problem of adjusting enough preload on our bearings, and that will make them run inefficiently and actually create more drag and more wear and so on. So those are the three goals that we wish to achieve. And now a small sort of a digression, but a planned one. When it comes to choosing your bottom bracket bearings, I will briefly discuss how that is done, and for those who just want to skip to the parts where I talk about spacers, you can use the table of contents or skip on the timeline. So if you're still here, let us discuss what I mean. If you need to buy new bottom bracket bearings, it is a good idea to measure and double check. Sometimes some owners and mechanics don't put the right parts, and so assuming that everything is correct is sometimes wrong. So it's not a bad idea to double check. And when you need to see what kind of bearings your bicycle takes and to know how many spacers you need, there are two dimensions that you need to measure. The first one is the bottom bracket shells width, and that you can measure with calipers or with a ruler. We will now move the camera to the bicycle to show how to measure that, but before that, just to note that we also need the shell for the bottom bracket on the frame, its inner diameter. So those are the two important dimensions: shell's width and inner diameter. Now we will move to the bicycle to show a few ways of how you can measure them. Let us go here. So the way to measure the bottom bracket shell's width is to use, for me it's the simplest to use calipers and just measure from one face to the other face. Here I have the right hand side cup already installed, so it's not as easy to align them, but that's for demonstrational purposes. I need to show something to not take much time on the video, but this is the basic principle. You can also use a ruler to measure that. It's more accurate when you're using calipers, but you can get it right pretty well with the ruler as well. Here my frame has some cable guides on the bottom, so that makes it more difficult to align the ruler properly. And this is a 68mm wide bottom bracket, and when I'm using a ruler like this, it's not as easy to measure accurately. So, but that is how you measure the width. And as far as diameter goes, you can also use a ruler to try and get it in the center and measure the diameter. However, that's not very precise for me. It's easier for me to use calipers. I also have a video explaining how to use calipers, so I will try to put that in the video's description as well, but this is what I'm aiming for. Basically, this is the measurement I'm taking, and here I got 33.4 millimeters. Okay, another problem when you're using this method is that you can move this a bit to one side or to the other side, and then you will get a smaller diameter compared to getting it right at the middle. So avoid any imprecision, inaccuracy when measuring, I also have a video and article explaining the difference between accuracy and precision and how measurements are done, and I will try to put that one also in the video's description, so about 100 days worth of watching and reading. But how to measure that more precisely. It's easier if you have some cups that are nicely fitting already in your frame, and it's more accurate to measure their outer diameter, especially with calipers, because then you know that you are aligned, these are parallel, so they are measuring what needs to be measured. For press fit bottom brackets, this is all that it takes. However, for the threaded ones, there are a few catches, and I will briefly just explain those. So, as you can see, the threads are interlaced, so you have the cup that screws into the frame, and that is why the outer diameter of the cup is greater than the inner diameter of the shell when you measure it. Otherwise you would be able to just press it in. So they are interlaced. So when you measure the outer diameter, you get a bit greater distance compared to measuring the inner diameter of the hub shell. So on my website there is an article showing and listing all the diameters, both inner for the shell and outer for the cups, for all the threaded bottom bracket standards. I'll put that as well in the video description. And I also have an article explaining and listing all the diameters for the press fit bottom brackets. That too will be available in the video description. I use that as a resource because there's no way for me to remember everything. There are so many different variations. But let me stay a bit longer on the threaded bottom brackets. Generally, most bicycles made in this century will have a bottom bracket that is threaded to the British standard, or English, however people call it. However, a newer, later standard is called T47, and when it comes to T47, you will get about 46 millimeters diameter. So if you have a diameter that's huge, it's most probably, as far as I know, at the moment of recording, there's only one threaded standard, and that is T47. However, for the smaller diameters, if you are at about 34-35 millimeters, then it gets a little bit trickier. There are several now decades obsolete standards that you are highly unlikely to come across, but there is one in addition to the British standard. There is another one that's more likely to be encountered on some Italian road bicycle frames, for example, especially, and similar, and that is the Italian standard. And it is very similar in diameter to the British, and again, British is the most common, so if it's not a huge hole, it's most probably British, but it could be Italian, so it's best to measure. How to measure it and how to tell the difference. Unscrew and remove the left hand side cup if you have cups already installed. Don't touch the right hand side one, just the left hand cup, and measure its outer diameter. And if you get a result that is below 35 millimeters, then it's British standard. If you get a result over 35 millimeters, then it's Italian. Here is an Italian for cup and cone system of bottom brackets, but you can see the diameter is over 35 millimeters. So that is important. If you're measuring hubs shell on the frame, if you don't have cups, then you can get smaller dimensions that are listed on my website, but roughly the British will be about 34 and the Italian will be about 35, but maybe not over them. So for those details, look at the website, but that's the basic difference. And why is that important? Okay, sorry. Another way to tell if your frame is Italian is that the bottom bracket shell will be 70 millimeters wide. All the other standards, the British and the T47, don't use that width. So if it's 70 millimeters, it's also another sign that it might be Italian, but it's best to double check both the width and the diameter to avoid one mistake in measurement causing problems. How can it cause problems? Well, with Italian bottom bracket standard, both cups are unscrewed counterclockwise, so it's a normal thread, which is a bad design, by the way. But for British and for T47, the right hand side cup is unscrewed clockwise. So you unscrew it in a direction that you would normally screw a bottom bracket cup in, or a screw in. So it's the opposite for the right hand side cup, and many people make mistake by trying to unscrew the right hand side cup counterclockwise, as they would do normally with all the other bolts and nuts, and then they end up tightening it or damaging threads and causing all sorts of headaches. So that's why I took so much time to explain this. It's touched upon in many of my other videos and articles, but I think it's worth, and you can always rewind. So now finally, if I didn't forget anything, we can now go to the spacers. Okay, so the action starts now. Okay, so for spacers, many Shimano's threaded bottom brackets require you to place one spacer of 2.5 millimeters thickness on the right hand side. So regardless of the other combinations, there's always one spacer on the right hand side of 2.5 millimeters thickness. Often when you buy bottom bracket cups, you will get it in a combination of two spacers, 1.8 and 0.7 millimeter thickness. Why did they do that? Well, that brings us to our goals when it comes to front chain line. They wanted to allow you to have the chain rings and the pedal symmetry and everything right, as it should be. But if you need to add some front derailleur that is held on in place by the bottom bracket cup, as I try to draw here, this is basically you put that bottom bracket through it and you tighten it, and then it also holds in place your front derailleur mounting, or some chain guard or similar. There are some mounts that are held in place by the bottom bracket cups. So if you're using that, then because they already designed that 2.5 millimeters extra room, so you always have a spacer. If you're using one of these, depending on how thick they are, you can remove all the 2.5 millimeters and just put that thingy, or remove one of these. Either you want, if it's 1.8 or so thick, then you just remove the 0.7 millimeter spacer of the two thin ones you get, and so you can get your chain line and pedals correctly, but still be able to mount chain guards and similar stuff. So that is why they designed most, but not all, of their cups, and as far as I know, all the threaded ones with the 2.5 millimeter spacer. So that is like a given. And now let's talk about the other systems and the other widths and spacers. But first let me show you spacers, just 1 second. Okay, sorry for the interruption. I forgot to have these at hand. So this is 1.8 millimeter spacer next to a 2.5 millimeter spacer. I don't have a 0.7 millimeter spacer right now with me, but when I align the 0.7 with the 1.8, I get the same thickness as the 2.5 millimeter spacer. So those are the options that you have. Now let us move on. When it comes to bottom brackets, here is I will start with a road bicycle. If you have a crank that is for road bicycle, so a 105, Ultegra, and Sora and similar, and in that case they are designed for the 68 millimeter bottom bracket shell on the frame. They will not work very nice with or fit the wider ones, though there are models for the 83 millimeter wide shells. So when you're buying, double check depending on your frame. So that's the first thing. You should know what kind of bottom bracket shell your frame, your cranks fit, and when you're buying new cranks, double check if they fit there. But for the most common road bicycle frames, we have either 68 millimeter width or 70 millimeter width for the Italians. And when you buy cups for those road bicycle bottom brackets, here I have this model. This one is marked that it fits 68, or you can buy the alternative model for the 70 millimeter bottom bracket. When you're dealing with those, then all you need is only one 2.5 millimeter spacer, and that's it. What is the catch? Here I will try to show it. This is, we have the right hand side cup for the mountain bike bottom bracket and for the road bike. And you can see that the road bike bottom bracket is a bit thicker here. I will try to measure them for comparison. So here we have 11.4, 11.5, something like that, and that is for the road bike. And for the MTB we have 10.49. So the road bicycle bottom bracket cups have this part a bit thicker, and so, but they are not thicker by 2.5 millimeters. They are just 1 millimeter thicker. So on both sides you get about 1 millimeter more compared to using the mountain bike cups. And so you only need 2.5 millimeter spacers, and those two cups, install them and you're good. If you decide to use mountain bike bottom bracket cups, you might end up with if you use only one 2.5 millimeter spacer I'll get to that, sorry, just a second. Now let's talk about mountain bicycle bottom bracket cups. As you can see, the right hand cup has longer threads. It has a bit more thread here, and that has a good reason. Shimano usually sells their mountain bike bottom bracket cups to fit both 68 and 73 millimeter wide, and it also makes them for the 83 millimeter wide, a different model. And so how do they achieve that? Well, you saw that they made longer threads, so their design is you always go with the 2.5 millimeter, the default one, as I explained earlier. But if your frame is 68 millimeters wide, you also need to add 2.5 millimeter spacer, extra one on the right and 2.5 millimeter on the left. So you get effectively 5 millimeters more. On the other hand, if your frame is 73 millimeters wide, the shell, then you don't use the two extra spacers, just the default one for the right hand side. And so, because the frame is wider by 5 millimeters, 73 compared to 68, so you remove those two spacers, and then you have the bottom bracket cups at the same distance from each other compared to fitting them on a 68 millimeter frame with two extra spacers. So that is the idea for the chain line and the pedal symmetry and so on. And this leads us to one catch, and that is if you have a road bicycle crank or cranks and you're trying to use bottom brackets for mountain bikes. They are designed to be a little bit wider because mountain bikes use a bit wider chain line, so they want the front line to align with the wider rear chain line. And in that case you might end up with your axle not protruding enough to mount the pedal, and that could be a problem. You can play with that by making some custom spacers so that you don't have 5 millimeters more on a 68 millimeter bottom bracket, but to make that a bit smaller. You need about half millimeter spacers or 1 millimeter of spacers on each side, not 2.5, to get the bottom bracket cup ends at the same distance. So that is another thing to pay attention to, and to make sure that you did everything right. Shimano have this. They have this little thingy that is mounted on the left hand side pedal, and you mount it from the inner side and use a bolt to put it through here, so it's held in place. And then when you slide your crank onto the spindle, you should be able to press this to get in place and get aligned all the way. It has this little, like a small protrusion. Try to zoom it. This small protrusion, and that protrusion should fit in. Here, let me show you. This is where it goes in. This is the hole, and so when you mount your left hand crank, and this, when you tilt it, should come in here. In case it cannot engage, it's either too far out or too close in, that means that your spindle length is not appropriate, or that you did not appropriately put enough spacers. If you put too many spacers, you will get it too far out, and that tells you that your left hand side crank will not have enough how to say, real estate to be held on tightly. So this is more like helping you to make sure that it's all aligned, it doesn't hold any strength. Likewise, if it cannot engage on this side, if it hits here, that means that your left spindle is too far here, and it usually will not go that far because this widens. But if you manage, you know that you've put it too far, and you will have this protruding outside and not be able to use the bolt at the end of the spindle to push the crank and create bearing preload adjusted. So in that case your spindle is protruding too far out. So that's what this is used for, and it's a neat system, and this is about 5 millimeters wide. So if I compare putting it to the middle, we have about 2.5 millimeters room to miss on the outside or on the inside. So there is some adjustment left. But if this fits and you mount it, you can unscrew the bolts and throw it away. It's not needed to hold the cranks in place. It's just used to keep everything aligned, to help you assure that you did everything properly. And so if you are playing with the chain line, as I tried to explain in this example of using bottom bracket cups for mountain bike cranks with a road bicycle crank like this one, then you will notice that your spacers, even if you put them by the book, it will be too wide and you will not be able to engage that little thingy. So you'd have to figure it out, and usually it helps with 1 millimeter spacer on each side. So or you could put 2.5 millimeters on both sides and remove just one and have your cranks moved a bit to the left. It's not a huge deal, but depending on your rear chain line and what you're trying to achieve. We'll watch that video about chain line, so I won't be going here into those details. And that is one thing. When you're dealing with 83 millimeter bottom brackets, for some reason Shimano designed those cups so that they have to be used with the default right hand side spacer, 2.5 millimeters, and extra 2, just like when we are using 68 millimeter frame with mountain bike bottom bracket cups. So they left some more adjustment there for some reason. I don't have the answer to tell you why, but it usually boils down to playing with the chain line, getting it right, and offering some room to wiggle it. For press fit bottom brackets, you usually don't need any extra spacers. They don't come with the default 2.5 millimeter for the right hand side crank usually, but if you have bottom bracket cups that are designed for 89.2 millimeters frames to 92 millimeter frames, then if your frame is 89.2, you add one 2.5 millimeter spacer just on the right hand side cup. And if your frame is 92 millimeters, then you add no spacers. That means that on a 89.2 millimeter frame, your crank will be a bit further to the right, and your pedal might end up being further to the right compared to the left pedal. But it's not a huge deal. 2.5 millimeters, I would say that's acceptable, and you most likely will not notice that when riding. Similar goes for the cups that are designed to work both with 104.5 millimeter frames and 107 millimeter frames. There we also have 2.5 millimeter difference, and if your frame is the narrower one, you add the 2.5 millimeter spacer on the right hand side cup before you press it in. So that is, I will just briefly show the principle. So this is what it boils down to. You put the spacer before you screw it in. Put anti-seize paste on both the threads and the spacer face and everything to make it sure it all works smoothly, or some grease, but that's the basic principle. Let me see if I forgot something to mention. I think I covered it all. In my video about installing Hollowtech II bottom brackets, we played a bit with the chain line, and if you watch that video you will see that we put more spacers on the left hand side and fewer on the right hand side, if memory serves me correctly. That is a deliberate mismatch, so to speak, and on that particular frame the cranks are moved a bit towards the left, but the chain line works well for what the bicycle's user uses the bike for, and that gets the job done. And if you have a front derailleur, that is another thing that you should pay attention to when you're playing with the chain line deliberately, because you must make sure that you do not move your cranks too far out or too close in, so that your front derailleur cannot shift to the largest, the most outward, or to the smallest chaining. So double check that as well, along with all the other things like spindle protrusion, getting your chain line right, and getting your pedals aligned. And I think this is the whole video. I don't think I forgot to say anything. And if you have any comments or questions or corrections or additions, use the comment section below. I hope this helps you. It is a bit, I tried to explain the basics, what you need to check and what you're looking for, and for most situations, as I said in the beginning, doing it by the book as the manufacturer says for your model of cranks and bottom brackets, you'll be good. And also make sure when you are buying cranks and bottom bracket bearings to check your frames bottom bracket shell, both width and diameter, because you can get some mismatches if you buy cranks that are too long for boost hubs and frames. You might not be able to fit them properly on a narrower frame. The threads of the cups, even though they make the MTB cups with a bit more thread on the right hand side, they are not unlimited. So if you put too many spacers, you might end up with not enough thread engagement. So that's another thing to pay attention to. So with mountain bottom bracket cups, the left and the right hand side have the same amount of thread, and so manufacturer says that you can put both 2.5 millimeter wide spacers on the right hand side, and so I successfully did the same but on the left hand cup, because it has the same length of thread and there were no problems. But if you exceed that, or if you take a road bicycle cup and decide to put more spacers on either side, so like 5 millimeters, you might have problems with not enough threads engaging, so you might rip your threads and damage and similar. So that's another thing to pay attention to. I think now I covered everything. Thank you very much for watching, and of course don't forget to like, share, subscribe. There's also you can also support my work using Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/BikeGremlin, of course, what else? You can make monthly or one-time donations or similar. That also helps. And that's it. That's the whole video. Cheers, stay cool. I'll see you in the next one.